Good morning, almost afternoon. Good morning, almost afternoon. Good morning. All right, good, okay. Now, I know everyone's really pumped and excited about RTI, right? Yes, everybody's on the ball. We love RTI. That's the right thing for kids, right? Right.
Yeah, so it's not really work.
Normally when we go out and present this, and we call it the RTI Squared Roadshow. We have been on the road quite a bit. I think we are up to 82 to 84 face-to-face district presentations across the state of Tennessee. Again, like she said, really collaborating with our boots on the ground. They're the ones who are out there doing the work for us. So again, my name is Ryan Mathis. Just real quick, I am the Mathematics Intervention Specialist for the Division of Special Populations. RTI Coordinator, she said that. I kind of felt like it was a big title. But RTI Coordinator, I was the RTI District Lead, RTI Coordinator at my school, and then on the RTI District Lead team back in my home state of Georgia when RTI was being rolled out. So I really speak more toward my involvement to RTI, toward K-12 foundational math skills, what that looks like in the trajectory of learning, and the characteristics of interventions that go along with those foundational skills K-12. So as I go through this process, normally when we present, this is a lot more fluid. We'll stop, we'll have a conversation. But that's normally when we have a 3-hour presentation, and this is just an hour, so unless y'all want to stay for about 5, right? No? Okay. Anyway, so if you have a question that we maybe can't get to, if you want to jot it down on your PowerPoint, we will be more than happy to stand out in the lobby after this presentation and answer those questions that maybe be some frustrations or concerns that may arise that you've experienced, or some questions that you may need answered. So again, looking at this RTI Squared framework, this graphic, when I came from Georgia, I said, how is RTI different here in the state of Tennessee than what I was already experiencing in Georgia? And the first thing we have to understand as all educators is RTI has been around. It's been around for 25 to 30 years. But what sets Tennessee apart is that squared piece. And I tell educators as I present across the state that really understanding that this sets Tennessee apart from any other state in the United States. Looking at response to not only intervention, but instruction. Looking at our Tier 1, our core instruction, we've got to look at that too, not just provide that intervention. So really understanding that this framework, this is Tennessee's initiative. And I also want to brag real quick on Tennessee, and I've been doing this with some districts. You know, as an educator, you hear about University of Oregon, where the Dibbles and everything is, and you hear about all these states up north that you think really has all these pieces of education together. Recently, Tennessee was contacted, and instead of being a part of the conversation, they were actually brought to the table. Ty and Teresa went to Chicago and got to sit around the table with RTI experts from Oregon, Kansas, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, discussing RTI. So Tennessee's on the forefront. Tennessee's on the forefront. I really like to brag on the progress that Tennessee's making in the classroom, at the district level, and also the state, working collaboratively. So that's huge for the state of Tennessee. So I just like to get that little bragging moment. So. You want to be on clicker for me? Sure. All right. Our new accountability system has 2 overarching objectives. Obviously, it's going to be growth for all students every year, but more importantly, it's going to be the faster growth for those students who are falling furthest behind. Also, our reliefs, these are your PowerPoints. I'm not going to go through all these. Any of you have ever met Joey Hassel, our Assistant Commissioner of Education of Special Populations. These are our beliefs as a division. Again, we are here to do what's right for all kids. All kids across the state of Tennessee. All kids have that right to receive that core instruction. And we also want to be a support system to you guys, not just a what, delivering the what, but giving you the how. And being in the present and helping you in whatever way that we can. So again, these are just our beliefs as a division. All right, I always like to spark this conversation, and we get a lot of feedback from this slide. And because we do have an hour, we're just going to take maybe about a minute on this question. But this question poses a lot of feedback, I guess you could say. What, in your opinion, is response to intervention? And then what is it not? What have you seen? Maybe out in the field? Just discuss it at your table real quick for about a minute, and we're going to share it. If I can bring everybody back so we can make sure we get through this presentation and answer any questions that may arise. Again, we only have an hour, so I want to keep y'all from lunch. So, all right, who's willing to share out and just kind of give me some examples, some things that you're thinking of in your mind? What is response to intervention and what is it not? Anybody want to share?
It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Okay. It is not a one-size-fits-all. Okay. Anybody else?
It's just not testing.
It's just testing.
No, it's just not.
It's just not testing. I'm sorry.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think I haven't heard that. Okay.
It is not a program.
Right. Not a program. Okay.
You can't give a little RTI in a box, right? Sorry.
Okay? She said it's for all students, not just your special education students. Okay? Anybody else? All right, those were all good things. So let's go into that. Response intervention is not just a special education initiative. Okay? It's not only for your students with disabilities. It's not only for beginning reading. It's not a new way to identify students with a specific learning disability. It's not a way of reducing costs or eliminating special education or the LD category. It's not this year's summer reform of RTI in a box. And it's not a way to fix schools with weak core instruction. Okay, so let's look at what it is. It is a set of processes for coordinating high-quality service delivery in schools. It's also a multi-tiered layered instructional approach that prevents problems first and then brings increasingly intense interventions to those students who don't respond. It is making instructional decisions based on that data. We're not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. It's using that data to drive our instructional decisions. It is integrating entitlement programs with general education. It is providing relevant data for SLD identification. And our primary goal here is improving academic and behavioral outcomes for our students by eliminating discrepancies between actual and expected performances. All right, now the key goals of special populations obviously is improving those student outcomes, but it's also doing that by prevention, intervention, sorry about that, achievement, outcomes, exactly, and also managing that performance. Now, as many of you know, as of July 1, 2014, RTI Squared is going to be the framework used by teams to identify a student with a disability, a specific learning disability. The final written approval from the state board was June 21st of 2013. Okay? Now, isn't this a pretty graphic? How many people have seen this graphic? Right? I could spend a large part of this presentation on this graphic because for me, as a general education teacher and someone who is not from the state of Tennessee and has seen the RTI process prior, this makes sense. Okay? Now, when you look at this graph, this is the overall goal of RTI Squared. This is the goal. But what we have found, and I can speak as I've presented to districts, administrators, teachers, they see this graphic and they have a little bit of a meltdown because they look at that triangle and they say, there's no way we're going to be there. Research shows this is the ideal model. This will take 3 to 5 years to get to. It's imperative that we tell our educators out in the state of Tennessee, our administrators and our teachers, that this is the goal. This is what we want to get to. So if I was administrator of a building, I would have this plastered everywhere because I would want my teachers to understand what the process is. Why are we doing this? Because we want to get here. This is the ideal model. It's the goal. We've had some comments that say, well, our triangle's upside down. We've had a rectangle. I've heard they had a circle. I've heard comments like that, you know? And so as we present, we say, you know, just calm down. This is the goal, to really get teachers to understand what is this framework we're doing? Why are you adding this, quote unquote, that they think to their plate? Really understanding what this framework's about. And I put a red arrow up there because for me, you know, when you have that aha moment, that's when it clicked. Looking at those guiding principles, first one being leadership. If your leadership at the district level and also at the school level is not on board, this cannot happen. It won't happen. Teachers look to our leaders to guide us in our decision making and to guide us in this buy-in. As a teacher, when this was rolled out, I didn't have the buy-in. I simply didn't. And I'll go into kind of some of my personal experiences without getting on a soapbox. But I didn't have the buy-in. So if your leadership is not there at the district and the school level, this can't happen. Teachers need to understand what they're being asked to do and being supported with that. So that leadership component is huge. Second, culture and collaboration. Starting at the state level, we said we've got to tear these silos down. Why is special ed to the left and why is gen ed to the right? Why? When I walked as a general education teacher, this is not the right way, but when I walked into school, it's just how it was done. I was told to send my 10 special education kids out of my classroom to the left. Those were not my kids. They were on my roster, but they were not my kids. And I essentially, and no fault of anybody, we were essentially making special education teachers tutors of the standards. They were expected to intervene on multiple grade levels of content that so a caseload of 30, okay? They have 3rd through 5th grade. Because they didn't understand the content in Tier 1 core instruction, we asked special education teachers to teach multiple grade levels of content, but also intervene for our most at-risk students. Okay? So we at the district level and at the local level have to break down that silo. Instead of working separate, we need to work together and understand each other and build that rapport. Also, prevention and early intervention. That's the goal. We want to prevent and intervene as early as possible. So let's say, for instance, when they walk into that middle school, you're no longer having to be a reactive model. Okay? We're the preventative model in elementary, but sometimes because we haven't maybe done this process in the best manner and identified and intervened on those specific skill deficits, they walk into middle school, into 6th and 7th grade on a 2nd and 3rd grade level. And now they're having to be reactive. That's the goal. That's the goal of this product. And it's going to take time and we're going to stumble, but that is the goal of this framework. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, but what I really like to hit up is those keywords and those numbers. People look at us at those numbers and they're a little overwhelmed, but we like to explain. Tier 1, even if you come to me and you say, well, our tier 1 core instruction is awesome. It may be awesome, but research shows that still, even if everything is in place, tier 1 core instruction, research shows that only 80 to 85% of your students are going to respond to tier 1 core instruction alone. Now, digging a little bit deeper into tier 2, you see that keyword some. 10 to 15% of your students in this ideal model now are going to need tier 2 in addition to tier 1. And then looking at that small percentage, few. 3 to 5% of your students are still going to need that tier 1 core instruction, but they're also going to need that tier 3 intensive core instruction. Okay? Now again, this is the ideal model. Is there any questions on this graphic? Sometimes that poses some conversation.
It's on the website, right?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
What are the middle words in the middle of the triangle?
The middle words, it is define, analyze,
No, the.
right here?
Sense, yeah.
database decision making.
Oh, thank you.
So the 3% comes from the 10% or from the 80%?
What now?
Do the 3% come from the 10%? I mean.
No, this is the overall, like out of 100%. 100% of your students. In the ideal model, only 80 to 85% are responding. Okay? Out of 80 to 85%, then 10 to 15 for tier 2, then 3 to 5 for tier 3.
I think
It's 3% of the general population will require tier 3 plus tier 1, not 3% that don't succeed in tier 2. It's 3% of the general population that will require that tier 3 intervention, even after they've been provided quality tier 1 and quality tier 2. We find that 3 to 5% need just more, and so we go to tier 3, and that's general population. That's not like a drop out through rate on tier 2.
so tier 3 don't go through tier 2 before they get to tier 3.
It
Not-
depends.
it
It
depends.
depends. So, and we'll talk more about that because I get your point of what you're asking. I think we'll get more into that, and if he doesn't answer it going through the next couple of slides, then we can come back to that. But the question really was, do they have to go through tier 2 to get to tier 3? Is that like the refining factor? Not necessarily. It depends on where that student's learning falls and how far below they actually are. So we'll talk about that. Yeah, thank you for bringing that question up. Are you done with this question?
Yes. Oh, yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Do those percentages hold regardless of population SES of the school, or is that strictly general population across the state?
Yeah, it holds regardless of the population, and it's not a perfect science because you're just looking at the research. The research showing that 80 to 85% of the students will respond to core instruction alone. But the simple factor is that's if you have perfect instruction, perfect everything going on. So regardless of the population that you're dealing with, you might have a larger portion of your population that aren't just getting tier 1 instruction alone because we don't have that high quality core instruction in place. Does that make sense? So those changes, those numbers are different depending on the population, such as in Tennessee. Everyone's in different places right now because that's assuming that everything's perfect in your model. All factors are taken out, everything's perfect. High quality core instruction, wonderful research-based interventions at tier 2, so that the majority of your students don't require tier 3 interventions. But we do know that that's not the reality right now in many places. So.
Is RTI going to completely take the place of testing for identifying learning disabilities? Like, completely?
Okay, so again, we'll get to that, and
Okay.
only because for the sake of time, but it does take the place of the IQ achievement discrepancy model. But it doesn't necessarily just take the place of all testing, because in our model, you still have to do additional measures of achievement before you can determine a student has a learning disability. So we're not RTI only, that's actually a mistake to say that. We actually use multiple sources of data, and the RTI data is one piece of that evaluation. Teams can still decide what other forms of assessment they would like to use as well. It's just one piece of it.
But students who might have a specific learning disability have to first go through all the tier processes, right? The tier.
Well, let me rephrase how you said it. Yes, we sooner rather than later identify students who have deficits instead of waiting until 3rd or 4th grade as we have the wait to fail model. We identify students much sooner in this framework who need intervention. We provide intervention, and if that intervention is not effective for them, then we may determine they need a more intensive intervention, which is special education. But in order for it to be more intensive, we surely have to shift our framework in special education, as we talked about this morning, in providing the most intensive interventions. But they do get intervention sooner rather than later in our RTI framework, yes, for sure.
But in this framework, the positive for it, that it shoots or sifts all the students as opposed to waiting for red flags and testing.
Yes. So this is looking at multiple sources of the data and identifying all students that are at risk, and your data team's actually sitting down and determining why that student's at risk. And so yes, a byproduct of what this framework does is make sure students don't fall through the cracks, or that we're not waiting until 3rd or 4th grade to identify. But I'm going to let Ryan go ahead and keep going, and then hopefully we can get to this part so that at the end, I like that you guys are asking questions throughout. I just want to make sure that we're able to get through the framework as a whole so you understand the whole framework, I guess. Yeah, okay.
All right, looking at tier 1, your core instruction, again, focusing on those numbers, 80-85% of research shows that students will respond to tier 1 alone. Now, this is high-quality instruction aligned to those Common Core state standards and structural decisions driven by ongoing formative assessment and high-quality professional development support are all going on in tier 1. Now, you're noticing that question came up, well, do they have to go through tier 2 to get to tier 3? Not necessarily. If you look right here, if a student is more than 1.5 to 2 years behind, they may immediately need tier 3 intervention. And that's going to be identified by your universal screening. Now, ongoing assessments will also be going on in tier 1, that core instruction. All right. Now, tier 1 in core instruction is classroom instruction for all. All students are general education students first. They all have that right to get that rich Common Core state standard instruction from a general education teacher, which is the content expert. Research shows, again, that 80 to 85% number. The recommended instructional times, I'm not going to read those off to you, but those are recommended. Ongoing assessments, the grade level checks, the benchmarks. You're going to be collecting data points during this time, determining patterns. You're going to track individuals and groups. You're going to guide instruction. You're going to teach, assess, monitor, adjust. In the fidelity monitoring, the team, the student data, etc. And also that universal screener that is going to be taking place in K-8. And then 9-12, we say you don't need a universal screener because you already have an overwhelming amount of data coming to you at the high school level that you can look at. But all of those things are taking place in tier 1, that core instruction. All right? Now, areas of deficit. Now, universal screener, you're going to give that blanket universal screener to all of your students 3 times a year. Okay? And it is going to explicitly measure basic reading skills, reading comprehension, written expression, reading fluency, math calculation, and math reasoning. All of those things are what a universal screener is going to explicitly measure. Again, you're giving this as a blanket screener to all of your students, almost like a temperature check to flag your students. Okay? Now, universal screener. So people ask us, what is that? Some people want to know a lot of other things about a universal screener. But looking at a universal screener, there's 2 types. There's a standards-based screener and a skills-based screener. So what's the difference? When looking at what you have as a district, you can say, okay, do I have a standards or a skills-based screener? Well, a standards-based screener is going to intervene on a particular standard. It's going to tell you what to reteach or remediate in tier 1, which is your core instruction. It's adaptive. It's going to change based on student performance. It does not consistently measure the same skill to determine if the actual intervention you're even providing is even working. All right? Now, switching over to a skills-based screener, this is going to intervene on a particular skill deficit or need that we just went over those 6 areas. It's a warning system. Your most at-risk students can identify their discrete skill deficit or deficits. It's not adaptive. It's not going to change based on student performance. It can consistently measures the same skill and is independent of grade level standard. And that is the difference between a skills-based and a standards-based universal stream. Any questions? Sometimes questions arise around that slide.
So when we get to this crossroads, we have to decide after the universal screeners get, we're using Ainsworth. After we give them, we already realize we're gonna have a large proportion of students that are going to qualify for tier two areas. But we also have to take into consideration where they are in acquiring the English language. So how does that fit into all of this?
That's Joanne's favorite topic.
Okay, so when we're looking and we're working with our ESL population and we're tying it into RTI squared, and you're correct, we are looking at multiple sources of data because we know that when our students enter our schools who are ESL population, they haven't mastered all their language acquisition skills that they need. So therefore, when we're giving them those assessments for language acquisition, we need to take into consideration their speaking levels, their listening levels, reading and writing. So let's say that I have a student who is new to the country, they're a newcomer, they have no foundations of English, so I'm going to have to start building that language acquisition for the student. Well, I'm also going to give them this universal screener. I know that my student cannot access the language on the universal screener, so therefore I'm already building an idea of so forth. But at the same time, I need to get them at that level where they can access the material that I'm presenting to them in the classroom. So I need to take into consideration what their performance level is on that language acquisition assessment, as well as what their summative assessments are noting and what the universal screener is telling me. So I have a newcomer who is at a level 1 for speaking, level 1 for listening, level 1 for reading, level 1 for writing. Everything is level 1 across the board. I cannot provide an academic intervention identified through my universal screener and my RTI square process at a school until I build that child's language acquisition. So that just goes back into having that rich structure at schools where we do allocate that time for our students to get that language acquisition structure in place. So that goes back, and I'm speaking from experience as we've been out with Tennessee districts, and we've been with areas with high populations of ESLs. That depends on what your structures look like at your schools. If you have an ESL teacher who is providing that core instruction for those students, that may lend itself to be that time where the students need those 60 minutes of that extra support for their ESL services. That may lend itself, but at the same time, you need those other structures outside that core instruction for those students. If you're in a setting where you may only have 2 to 4% ESL students, maybe 2 students, there may be a person that comes in and works with the classroom teacher, provides those supports for the students as part of their ESL minutes that they have in place for their supports. But if you have a child that is at a level 1, we have to be cautious as to how we provide these interventions, because our focus is to build their language acquisition, like you mentioned, and then transition them into those academic interventions. So let's say that I have a student, they're no longer a 1. They are at a 2, emerging to intermediate at a level 3 for their language acquisition. I, the teacher, and my data team, we know the child, we know the holistic child. We know that child at that level 2, emerging to that level 3, if they're going to be able to access the academic intervention. If I know that that student has built the foundations on basic sounds, they can produce basic words, they have knowledge of some sight words, they're able to communicate with their teacher, understand the language that is taking place not only in the playground, but the language that's taking place during their classroom discussions, then I can therefore offer those academic interventions. But you have to take a look at all those different sources of data. So that's why we emphasize those data schemes are very important. But I agree with you 100% that we have to look at all that information. We need to understand if they can access those interventions, because there will be a point where they can transition from the ESL supports that we have in place to those academic interventions. That's our ultimate goal. We want them to gain all the skills that they need to access that course.
In some systems, they're gonna coexist.
With the state, right, so I'm thinking there needs to be some type of either language support at tier 2. We're gonna do some teaming and decide factor in or factor out languages where we're going with
That's
that.
right, yes.
And that way, we can, instead of sending them to tier 2 to acquire a skill that they can acquire because they don't have
And
the
with us
language.
becoming a new WIDA state, since we're moving into the WIDA, if you haven't had a chance to visit the WIDA link, they provide some clear guidance as far as what that looks like with our students that are coming to us as newcomers or beginners. They provide guidance on what can take place as we're trying to build that language acquisition and transition them into a more academic intervention so that they're able to access that more.
And Jan Lanier and Joanne have been working on a document that kind of follows along with the WIDA that you'll be able to access off our SPIDIG site soon. We're going to have it uploaded that really walks through how do you make those decisions, you know, those decision markers really at language proficiency and when students can access interventions. I know districts like that we've met with have decided that students are going to get both at the same time because they're making that the priority, you know, considering the student, you know, can always benefit from early numeracy and early literacy skills in addition to that. So it depends on the resources in the district, like Joanne said, the population that the students that are in that district and how many resources are available. But I do know that we're working on that documentation and it just has to go through our communications review process, and once it does, it will be posted.
Go ahead.
Real quick, is RTI score recommending standard-based or skill-based universal screeners when we're reviewing over?
Skills-based.
Well, that's what I figured.
Yeah, because it really does us no good to identify that the student is low on a standard and intervene on a standard, because in that case we will actually be tutoring standards for the rest of the child's career. So student career. So really we're focused on skills-based universal screeners, and although we can't mandate that, we're really trying to get that information out to districts so that they have the understanding of what is going to help them move students that are at risk forward.
What is the WIDA acronym?
I'm sorry.
What is the WIDA acronym?
What does that stand for, the WIDA acronym?
Okay, so before I go into that, I know it's the consortia for, and I will get the title for you, and from another state.
World-class instructional design.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I never can remember
I was
that.
used to the cell, I'm sorry, moved from California, so I'm still gaining all the knowledge of all the assessments that are in place. It's wonderful to come into a place where, you know, we do have a correlation of the assessments, but all like the acronyms and so forth.
What, can you say that one more time out loud?
Oh, sorry, it's the world-class instructional design and assessment. WIDA.
Thank you, that's a good point. It almost just needs to be in the PowerPoint. I never remember what they all say, so like NICSIG, WIDA, what? I know what RTI stands for.
Question. On the universal screener, you said that it would be given 3 times a year. Is there a specific time when it's given each year, or during each, I guess, quarter, or however you call it, of the school year?
Yeah.
Is there a
So yes, in like my world, if you're using a curriculum-based measure, the benchmarks usually take place fall, winter, spring.
Right.
And so there's windows of time depending on the universal screener you're using, and they'll give you those windows of time so that they can actually get all the students taken at the same time so they can norm it. And get
I
the
just
information.
wondered if it was like they needed to be within the certain first few days of school, because I came from a district years ago where they tested kindergartners on benchmark the very first day.
Yeah.
But that was at the very beginning of our.
That would probably be a district decision. I do know if you're using large universal screeners though, that they have dates and windows of time typically that you do all the testing and so that they can norm it. So.
All right, these are just going to be some resources. I'll go through these quickly. You'll see that there's some literacy tables. Joanne and I, what we have found when we presented to districts, teachers and districts are going, you want us to intervene, but how do we intervene on that particular skill deficit? And then what does a good intervention look like? You know, when I came and said I didn't know there was so much red tape, so we can't name interventions in threat of being sued. So I can't name those interventions to you. But what we did was we wanted to give some guidance to districts because teachers want to do it, they just need to know how to. So this is a literacy table that is a draft document that Joanne is creating. Basically, what the definition is with the domain area, the associated deficit areas, examples of some curriculum-based measures, but then also free resources. But we also have just adapted this not too long ago to put the characteristics of what a good intervention looks like. So she has created that table, and if Ty wants to keep clicking, I'll speak to mine. What we did was I developed with David Williams, who is our math guru in curriculum instruction, With the trajectory of learning K-12, the foundational skills that are needed for mathematics. What are the characteristics of a good intervention for each foundational skill? How does it impact them in the core instruction? And so really teachers can take that and understand. And what we found as we presented to the district, a 6th grade teacher, even though they understand the standards needed to get there, those foundational skills, seeing that on a chart, help them understand what they may be lacking by the time they get to them in 6th grade. So again, this is a resource that we can email to you guys. We didn't bring it because it is a draft document and it's ever changing, but that is something that we're trying to get out to districts as we present to give some teachers some guidance.
Actually, we're gonna upload it to the SPEDIG site, which is gonna be at the end of the presentation, I believe. So we can actually keep adding stuff, and so we're gonna add that this week, so you'll be able to get it on there.
And again, it's going to keep going. Math's a little bit more detailed than Joanne's. As we know, math calculation, math reasoning is a lot of things. So it's fun. So.
Math problem solved.
You're gonna upload them to the mayor's website or to?
The SPEDIG site, which is tnspdg.com. It's on the
It's on the back page.
It's on the very back. You don't want to write it, but that is our special education or the special projects development grant website. So that's where a lot of our information will be posted. All right. Now, as we presented through the district, administrators at the district level and at the school level have said this is the most powerful slide for their general education teachers and their special education teachers to see. And we have even gotten feedback from the teachers saying they finally understood. So real quick, 1 minute, because I want to make sure we have time. In your mind, what is reteaching and what is intervention? Real quick. Take about a minute.
Is reactive.
Yes. While you guys are back, I just kind of wanted to have that discussion. I know. I've got through my class. I had to do that the other day when I used to do my 3rd grade. But I'll just get that. Okay. Anyone want to share in their mind what reteaching is versus intervention? Hey, go right ahead.
We just talked about how reteaching is more reactive.
Okay.
And how intervention is more proactive because you're looking at what's missing and then you're trying to fill in those holes. Once you get to reteaching and remediation, the student has already not mastered the skill, and so you're trying to play catch up.
Okay. Anybody else? Very good answer. All right. Anybody else? Okay. If you were in the last session, you kind of heard a little bit of a spiel, but I didn't really go into too much of it because when I told you that there was no teacher buy-in on my end, there was not. And I remember I had a great leader who posed this question when RTI was being funneled down because I viewed it as just something else. From the State Department at the Ivory Tower, not understanding my school climate and what was all on my plate. That's exactly how I interpret it. But that leadership component that I spoke to is what my principal did so well. She posed this question at a faculty meeting. It was at 4:30 in the afternoon. I was done. And she said, look at this question and think about it. Take 2 weeks and come back to me. And again, I didn't think much of it. But if you were in the last session, you heard me speak about that lesson that I just thought was so awesome. I had all my groups going on, my whole group instruction, and one of those lessons that I said, if my principal comes and observes me and does an evaluation, I'm going to give a 5. But they don't come and observe. It was one of those. So we even had a code word down the hall when she was coming. It didn't happen. But I remember it came Friday, and I assessed my students in math, and 70% of my students failed that assessment. Again, if you were in here last time, I apologize, but whose fault is that? It's mine. And I remember I threw my hands up and I said, well, these kids obviously don't understand what I was teaching. They need intervention. They need intervention. They didn't get it. I did everything right. They didn't get it. And then that's when I was like, okay, well, I just don't. And then that's when it clicked. And this little slide, this 2-pronged question came back in my head. That's not intervention. I got to go back and look at what I did. Did I deliver the whole group instruction in the best possible manner? Were my groups cohesive? Were the personalities that I was grouping? Was that good grouping? The independent work that I was having them do, could that even be done independently? I had to go back and differentiate and scaffold my instruction to meet the needs of my learners, not the learners meet the needs of my teaching style. And that's when I really understood, and that's where the buy-in for me came in. Because no fault of our own as general education teachers, sometimes we don't know the clear difference. I did not. I did not know the clear difference between the two when I stepped foot into that school. And so really understanding this really helps me understand the whole framework behind response to intervention. Okay? Does anyone, like maybe who works in the district, we get that sometimes, again, no fault of their own, that sometimes this is a bit of confusion for teachers. Do y'all see that sometimes? not really understanding that explicit difference. And again, it's no fault of their own. It's just we really have never had those conversations. Okay? We've heard from districts that that has been one of the most powerful slides as they re-deliver to their teachers. All right, again, just looking really quickly, what does reteaching intervention look like? Well, reteaching, obviously, that is taking place in Tier 1. Your goal here is to reteach standards that students are struggling with rather than skill deficits. We often call those kids the bubble kids. We have to go back and try again. The standards-based assessments are going on, the benchmark, summative and formative, all taking place in Tier 1, that reteaching model. Going over to intervention, that's your Tier 2, Tier 3, and special education being your most intensive intervention. Now the goal here is to provide those research-based interventions that are aligned to those specific skilled area deficits that the universal screener identified that we mentioned earlier. Also, skills-based assessments are going on, the universal screener aligned to areas of deficit, progress monitoring tool aligned to areas of deficit, and also formative assessment.
And this is just really where your data teams and the teachers are really involved in determining what the kids' actual needs are. You have lots of kids who don't understand a standard that do need remediation or reteaching. They are truly what has now been coined as the bubble kids, which I can't stand that term, but that is what that means. But there are kids who truly have skills deficits, and you can bubble them all day long, but you're going to continue all the way through their school career, and that's the point. You must address their skill deficit. That is intervention. So vocabulary-wise, communication-wise out there between general education, special education, teacher to teacher, reteaching is Tier 1, it's standards. Skill-specific intervention is the intervention. Tier 2, Tier 3, or special education, it is skill-specific. Students are struggling reading fluency, they get reading fluency intervention. That's an intervention. But if they are struggling on standard A and they don't have reading deficits, then they need reteaching or tutoring of a standard. There's a clear distinction there.
All right, now we've done Tier 1, we've talked about that. We're now going to Tier 2. This is where Ty just segued that beautifully. The data teams come in and they are crucial. This is normally where Joanne and I will spend a lot of time to districts explaining what a good data team looks like, how best you could go about it, but because of time's sake, I'm not going to go into that too much. If y'all do have any concerns afterwards, feel free to come and talk to us. But Tier 2, again, in an ideal model, this is your target intervention. 10 to 15% of your students are going to need Tier 2 in addition to Tier 1. So this addresses the needs of your struggling and advanced students. Okay? It's additional time beyond time allotted for the core instruction. It's high-quality intervention matched to the student target area of need, just like Ty said. You need to intervene on that foundational skill that student's lacking. It's like when we first came together as a data team, and we said, well, he's got a math calculation deficit. Put them all on math calculation. Well, what are you intervening? It's not a one-size-fits-all. You've got to survey level assess down and figure out what that foundational skill is that student's lacking and intervene there first. It's, again, provided by highly trained personnel. Now, as we've gone through the districts, highly trained personnel has been a little bit confusing to some districts. Highly trained personnel has nothing to do with a degree. Highly trained personnel means they are highly trained on the intervention that they are providing. They have been trained on how to deliver that with fidelity and how best to use that in the intervention. That is what highly trained personnel means. Also, progress monitoring is required for those database decision making. So progress monitoring should be occurring in Tier 2. And we like to say if you schedule Tier 2 during the day, it'll happen. Okay? Tier 2, 30 minutes scheduled into your day, it'll happen. And just a quick example of how it looked in my district, what we did was we used a walk to learn model, which is not mandated by the state, but this is where every single student in 3rd grade went somewhere. They went somewhere. What we did when we came together as a data team, we first grouped those kids who were 10 to 15%. We put them in group first, then our reteaching kids, and then our advanced learners. And we paired interventionists accordingly. But again, it's a walk to learn model where everyone went somewhere. Now looking at Tier 2 interventions, a change in intervention will be considered within each tier before moving on to the next tier of intervention. 8 to 10 data points if you're progress monitoring every other week. 10 to 15 data points if you're progress monitoring weekly are needed to make that sound database decision. Now the number of data points reflects research in order to make that informed database decision. The intervention must have evidence supporting its use in remediation in areas of suspected disability. And also progress monitoring, again, must be able to provide evidence that the student did not make a sufficient amount of progress in the area of deficit. Okay? So now this is all some of just like the meat that's going on at Tier 2. And again, this is a brief overview. So we're going to go into Tier 3 because of time, but again, if you have any questions.
Okay, so in looking at the characteristics of Tier 3, I'm going to grab the clicker type. Okay, so we're looking at our population. where Ryan mentioned earlier, our core instruction, beautiful core instruction, it's going to meet the needs of 80 to 85% of our students, as you mentioned earlier with the graphic. Well, we know that 3 to 5% of our students are going to need a more intense intervention at Tier 3. So we're looking at that small number of students who are, let's say, let's consider this example, our students that are coming in a year and a half to 2 or more years behind. We're looking at students who are going to be performing below the 10th percentile when we administer that universal screener. So all that takes into place when we're looking at students that need that 3 to 5% of students that's going to need that Tier 3 support. So we're looking at a smaller group of kids. So we're saying that at Tier 3, our interventions have to be more intense. If we are providing an intervention for students at Tier 2 and the student is not being successful at Tier 2, and we're having those database decision teams come together and analyze all that data and say, you know what, these structures have been in place, we have fidelity checks with our intervention, our student, we have sufficient data, analyzing that the student has not made sufficient progress, and then we refer them for Tier 3 to receive those supports. We know that we need to change that intervention to something that's more intense because what we were providing in Tier 2 was not meeting their needs. If we have a child that's coming into our school systems and they're behind a year and a half to 2 years, we would not, best practice would be not to provide that same intervention that we're providing to students at Tier 2, because if it's not intense as it should be for Tier 3, it's not going to meet the needs of their skill deficits. So having that universal screener in place is very vital in helping identify the skill deficit area, and having those survey level assessments like your reading inventories, your phonics assessments, awareness, your drill down assessments that you may have in place for mathematics. They're very vital in identifying those foundational skills, because if we do have a student that's behind a year and a half to 2 year or more possibly, we need to know exactly where we're intervening. We need to know what characteristics to look for in an intense intervention that's going to target the need of that child. Here in Tier 3, our time now shifts. We're no longer providing that 30-minute support. We're shifting to 45 to 60 minutes. We say 45 to 60 minutes because research shows that many of the interventions that are out there that are research-based, and if you they have strong support with groups of students that have been placing these interventions and have shown success, range from 45 to 60 minutes. So that's what we mean by more intensity when we're looking at Tier 3. Having those research-based interventions in place, making sure that those supports are more intense than what we have in Tier 2. We're still keeping fidelity to the highly qualified trained professional that's providing that intervention. And here we have to be more careful as to who provides the intervention, because we want to make sure that we're using that expert of the intervention to provide those supports for that student. Does the student need more intense intervention? Students may immediately require Tier 3 intensive interventions, I mentioned earlier, depending upon at what performance level they're entering our school systems. Students who are immediately placed in Tier 3 level intervention must receive the minimum number of recommended minutes for the intervention, as I mentioned, 45 to 60 minutes. And the purpose of immediately placing a student in Tier 3 intervention is to increase the intensity of the intervention, not to shorten the duration of the intervention period. Our overall goal is to catch these students and be that model of early intervention so that we're able to target their needs as soon as they enter the school system. We don't want to place them in Tier 2 if we know they're significantly behind, and then place them into Tier 3 because we're not providing that intense intervention where they need it at their level.
So a good piece of information around Tier 3, and I got this actually from a principal in Principal Academy that we were training on, is that RTI is not raised to identify, right? So we really want to provide the level of intensive intervention that is required for where the student is. So we're not trying to move students to Tier 3 so we can just move forward for special education. Just because they move to Tier 3 doesn't mean they don't require that amount of time to respond to intensive interventions. And so she kind of made that analogy of like RTI is not raised to identify. What is it that we're going to provide in special education that's more intensive than Tier 3? If in fact the student requires more intensive than Tier 3, then we must provide more intensive intervention in special education. But that's not always the case right now. So that race to the identify concept is really what we're hitting on here. They still require the amount of time to respond to the interventions. It's not a race to get them in special education. Oh, okay. So I guess I'm picking up on this part here. So there's a lot of questions around school psychologists and what we can do and survey level assessments, and I don't know if some of those are in your training program, so I'm just going to touch on these a little bit. So additional assessment to determine intervention does not require a signature from a parent. Teachers do this all the time. They do DRAs, they do progress monitoring assessments, they do informal phonics inventories like Joanne said. Those don't require signatures of parents. When you're looking at going into some significant standardized assessments around, I mean, I could throw out examples of standardized assessments, but then you might want to be a little more cautious and get some signatures on there. I know as practicing school psychologist, I would have gotten signatures. But I did provide help in the school setting in doing informal phonics inventories and things of that nature that did not require parent permission. And so everyone on the team is considered experts and can help with survey level assessments without parent signatures. Initial evaluations. So basically the point is moving from tier 3 and that concept of RTI. If you're coming to the team and the student, you have all this data and you're saying tier 3 didn't work out, tier 2 and tier 3 did not work out, we have sufficient amount of progress monitoring data, this student did not respond to these interventions, then of course you're going to move forward with a referral for special education. But one thing that I like to caution here is the team has just admitted in their building that the intensity of tier 3 was not enough or sufficient to meet the student's needs. Therefore, this team is also discussing how special education intervention is going to meet the needs of that student. And they're also discussing how it's the most intensive intervention in their school. And if it's not, then you need to begin discussing that information. And we are very relentless in our focus on special education becoming the most intensive intervention. And if it's not, then we have to reconsider what we're doing. So yes, in fact, you can go for, get a consent for an initial evaluation, but again, this isn't a trade-off, general education to special education. During the evaluation period, whatever the team determines that may be, and I know that question came up earlier, this student remains in intervention and continues to be progress monitored because, and it has happened, as a school psychologist, I knew that when students are in intervention, they may begin to respond during that evaluation period. And if they start significantly responding, then we might have an agreement between the parents and the school to wait and let's see how much this intervention actually does work. You cannot determine that tier 3 or additional intervention is not going to work for that student during an evaluation period. They stay with the intervention and continue to be progress monitored. And the school psychologist and the team is required to use all of that data in making the decision for students. This is just the SLD identification, so if a student's referred, this is what must be considered at the table. Again, specific learning disability identification is a byproduct of response to instruction and intervention. It really is a collaborative effort between general education and special education, but it is not special education leading this framework. This is a general education framework to get students intervention sooner rather than later. Stop the wait to fail model. Stop waiting to identify students in 3rd and 4th grade where they're so significantly behind that, and then expect special education to pick up all the pieces and put them back together and provide core instruction and intensive intervention all at the same time. It's not working. Our data proves it's not working. So if in fact we go through with an SLD identification, this is what you're looking at. You're going to do an additional measure of underachievement. In the state of Tennessee, it is required that you do another standard form of assessment around all the areas of deficits that is in question around the specific learning disability. So you're going to do another underachievement assessment to substantiate or negate the RTI data that you have. So condition 1 is that achievement assessment. Condition 2 is all of your data through RTI framework. That you've collected to show that they did not respond to the intervention. And then condition 3 is something that has always been in place, that has not changed. This has always been considered, and those are just exclusionary factors. Is there another area of disability that better explains the student's needs? Have we ruled out limited English proficiency, excessive absences? If students aren't available for instruction or intervention, how can we say they have a disability, right? Things of those nature that we've always looked at, teams have always looked at. Reevaluations, as of January 1, 2014, RTI is the framework used for identification, okay? So teams, and we have been for the last year and a half all over the state saying even students who are receiving special education intervention right now must be progress monitored, because when we go for a reevaluation, you have to look at that data to substantiate or negate whether the student continues to have a disability. It's not a given that students still have a disability when their 3-year reeval comes up. Hopefully our intent is they won't, right? So progress monitoring is required for reevaluations right now. And you don't want to get yourself into a situation, or school systems don't, where they don't have data to support the eligibility when they come to an IEP team meeting. So
Is that in addition to the 3 times benchmark?
So, let me help you with that. So all students receive universal screener, but only students who are considered of having deficits in those areas and are receiving intervention get progress monitored, right? So we're progress monitoring whether our intervention is working for that student. So whether the student is receiving intervention at Tier 2 and Tier 3, or they're receiving special education intervention, we must progress monitor to make sure what we're doing, the intervention we're providing, is actually working. And if it's not, you change it. So yes, progress monitoring is required for those students who have a specific learning disability, because we've already determined that they're low in that area and we're providing intervention. So basically the rest of this really is around looking at the gap analysis and the ROI, and really that's just the rate of improvement. So how long, how far do we need to get to close that gap for students? And really a lot of the tools that districts have chosen actually do that for them. And that's just a beautiful world when that happens, because it's a lot less confusing. But what happens if parents request an evaluation? That's always a fun conversation. One thing that we've really prided ourselves in doing is our connections with our parents and our advocacy groups. We've been training them. We've provided webinars. We've done Q&As. We've actually trained some of the advocates to train parents. So it's been a really good information sector to get that out to those populations. So parents can really understand what it is that we're doing right now and why we're doing it. And overwhelmingly, there's been a lot of support from parents. They just want to know, what are you doing with my child, and is my child making progress? And if you can show parents data that what we're doing and what we're providing is increasing the outcomes for your child, they're pretty appreciative of that. And as a practicing psychologist for over 12 years, I only had parents push me twice coming from the state that used RTI to go ahead with an evaluation on their child when I had evidence that their child was making progress. It just doesn't happen if you show the parents the evidence. They want to know what's happening with what I can say, their babies. So basically, here's the thing. If a parent still continues to want that evaluation and you don't have enough data points, a couple things can happen. I mean, one, you could do what I do not suggest and say, we're not going to evaluate, and issue them a prior written notice and say, no, we're not going to evaluate, the team doesn't agree with you. Probably not the best option if you want to keep yourself out of legal suits. So what we have suggested to do is ask for an evaluation from the State Department. So our timeline extension from the State Department, and so that you can tell the parents, while the student continues on with intervention, we progress monitor. Here's the extended timeline that we have, and we'll continue to collect the data. And when we have enough data, then we can determine eligibility. Or you can move forward with the evaluation, take the data that you have and the data that continue to collect during the evaluation time and come to the table. If you don't have enough data to support response to instruction and intervention was not sufficient to meet their needs, then you have to say ineligible. And then we can talk about a time to meet back to re-look at that information. Or you can just have the conversation at the data team with the parent and say, here's when we'll have enough data. These are the amount of weeks the student's been in intervention. Here's what the progress monitoring data is showing. We agree upon a date of when, if the student's not making progress, this is when we'll begin to look at that. So there are several options to do. The first one not being my favorite, because I think it's about relationship building with parents and trust and really working through what makes sense for their child.
So the discrepancy option is not okay?
No, not at all. No, it hasn't been.
Have parents sued the state rep?
No, not at all. So actually, that's what I'm saying. We've been out with the parent advocacy communities, and this has been. I will go back and say, because I like that statement. So, in this framework, this wasn't the State Department who actually made the framework. So we actually had representatives from LAs across the state of Tennessee that actually went through and developed this framework. Then we hired national consultants to come in and look at our framework, and they had a lot of scribbly marks and doing things that we had to actually do differently based on national level legal suits. So we changed those to reflect within. So we have really went through a significant process for legal, outside experts for consulting, also LEAs for information into the RTI framework. So this wasn't state design necessarily, this was multiple district and consultant and legal design. So we feel like we have a pretty rock solid framework, and just given the fact that we have been involved with other states and what they have, they also feel, and some of them have been way ahead of us in this, but feel that we have a very good legal sound framework moving forward. So basically our concept around this, consider this, special education is not a place. We've got to get interventions to students rather than later, and then if they require the most intensive intervention, that's just it. Students require high quality core instruction and intervention in addition to that core instruction, whether it's Tier 2, Tier 3, or special education. It's not a place. And Allison brought that up in our last presentation, that moving from what should be talked about as specialized instruction and intervention to just saying special education assumes that it's a place. So we're really moving away from talking about it as special education, but it's specialized instruction and intervention. Students have an IEP for a reason. They have skills deficits, and we have to work towards closing those gaps. So again, we're focused on that quality of instruction and intervention moving forward for students. And basically, that is pretty much the framework in general. The one thing that we do like to point out, some confusion has been our focus on core instruction, and if students need interventions, Tier 2, core instruction, Tier 3, core instruction, special education. It's not in addition to. We've had some people building upon, so they're trying to schedule kids in Tier 2, in addition Tier 3. It's core instruction, Tier 2 intervention, if that's not intensive enough, core, Tier 3, core special education intervention.
You said that this model is for all children.
All children.
So where do gifted children fit?
Yeah. Ryan kind of spoke to that earlier, and we're actually expanding all of our information on advanced students. So in a really good master schedule, and I think you said the master schedule earlier, in a really good master schedule, all students are somewhere in the building for 30 minutes of intervention time. We don't have to call it intervention. People call it something to use tiger time, whatever time. But basically, the whole school drops and intervenes. And we have high schools in the state of Tennessee actually doing this right now. So all teachers are assigned to an intervention group. Some are advancing students. Some have skills deficits. Some are remediation. And some are just special projects like CTE at the high school level that are actually involved in providing something for 30 minutes out of the day. So you actually, in a good master schedule, can meet the needs of all your students in a school setting. And we have many. We had really good examples in the beginning. We thought were good examples. And now all of a sudden, these schools are developing these models that are blowing our examples out of the way. So now we're just grabbing those and starting to post those through the RTI framework. But really thinking outside that box and how you can meet the needs of all your kids, not just skills deficits, but actually advancing students as well.
So we identify them through the development screener?
No, that's a good question. So the way that we did it in my school setting was we did give a universal screen to everyone, but what happened with advancing students is they have these like wings, right? They're like flying up here somewhere. And so they're way above. So then we're going to investigate more and determine, which areas are they advanced in and where can we provide that enrichment, and then we move forward that way. So it doesn't necessarily give you that significant data to say, here's exactly where you intervene for an advancing student. So
what do you use, IQ test or something?
no, that would be, I guess, if you were going for gifted, but not all students are gifted, right? So when you're grouping students, you're going to know if they need enrichment in the area of, the reading content. They need to be scaffolded up with, if you will, and you can be doing just any enrichment activities around their area of strength. Many students are advanced in one area, but not the other. They might be reading, not math, or math, not reading. So what you would do in that situation, just like any student, you're like, this student is the top of this group of students, and so you can group those. And sometimes they're across multiple grade levels. So what we did is just really take all of our data to determine where they're advancing and how to enrich them in that area. So Again, this is just another, representation of what the expectation is. Core instruction plus tier 2, core instruction plus tier 3, and core instruction plus special education. And special education on this continuum being the most intensive intervention. Do you want to go with the implementation guide? Sure.
The response instruction intervention implementation guide is about 287 pages, so if you want to read all of it, you're more than welcome to. But what we've done is we've compiled free schedules from actual districts, master schedules, so districts can use. We've also sample forms, the universal screener and intervention rubrics, guidance for database decision making, parent letters, brochures to go home about RTI, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Those are all on our SPDIG site, which is, there you go. The SPDIG site and on the 10-Court website as well for those resources. And if you have any RTI questions that come up, you don't know who to pinpoint them to, you can send them to rtiquestions@tn.gov and it'll be dispersed to who it needs to go to. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can do that. And normally this is the RTI Roadshow, so that's why all the team members are not present. But again, Teresa Nichols is our Evaluation Services Coordinator, can answer live your special educational questions. Suzanne Keese, a guru at middle school and high school scheduling and interventions, what that looks like in middle school and high school. And then also, I can speak to more of the elementary side and those mathematics pieces. So again, sorry we held you over. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask us up here at the front, please come do so. But if not, thank y'all.